Hey there everyone, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the restoration process of the Star Fox 64 OST. A few people have asked about it and I really want to explain a bit further how I went about everything. Plus, I'd really like to explain some things for people who are looking into doing more things with sound fonts, or just MIDI things in general, since that was the core of this project. For starters, I used Ableton Live for this entire project. Now, this isn't the only program that you can use for something like this. You could use like FL Studio or Logic Pro, whatever you're comfortable with, but I'm most comfortable with Ableton Live since that's the one I've used the most. Inside Ableton, there's a small program called the Sampler, which, as the name implies, samples audio files. This is how we can get the uncompressed samples into Ableton. Once you drag a sample into the sampler, it's now ready to be played by MIDI data that we insert on a MIDI track. However, there's a few more things that we have to do in order for the sample to actually sound right. Each of these samples found in the leak have a certain tuning associated with them. For example, this string sample has to be tuned to F# 4. While figuring all of this out, I found that most tunings wouldn't be exactly correct, most of the time being off by an octave. In this case, this string sample needs to be tuned an octave lower at F# 3. Now each of the notes will actually sound like what they're supposed to when being played back. The next thing we have to do is make sure the sample envelope doesn't make the sample sound unnatural. The envelope involves the ADSR of the sample, as well as how much the sample is affected by the velocity of MIDI notes. ADSR is the attack, decay, sustain, and release of any given sample. The main one I changed pretty much every time I inserted a new sample was the release, as all of these samples have a fairly long release to them. After changing that, I needed to make sure that these samples were somewhat responsive to the velocity of the MIDI notes. Velocity is something each MIDI note has, and is usually used to determine how loud or soft a note is played. It's like pressing down a piano key. The harder you press down, the louder the note will sound. I usually ended up letting the velocity influence the volume of the sample by 37%. And I turned down the general volume of the envelope to -18 decibels to account for the velocity change. This wasn't the case for all of the samples, but most of them. After all of that, the string sample is now ready to be played in a MIDI track. Here I have the MIDI tracks for the Versus song, played when you have more than 2 people playing in Versus mode. Once I find what I think to be the track for the high strings, I move that sampler onto the track and play the MIDI sequence to make sure it's the right one. This is roughly the same process I would do for every single instrument. Really quickly, I would like to talk about the percussion tracks. Normally with Hajime Wakai's pieces, the percussion tracks tend to have multiple instruments on the same track. While I'm not sure how you would achieve this in other programs, using the sampler in Ableton allows you to account for this. Using the zone feature, you can insert multiple samples into one sampler and specify which sample plays on a given note. In the case of the percussion track, one note is used for the snare, one note is used for the cymbal crash, and one note is used for the kick drum. This allows all the percussion to stay on one track instead of having each separate sample be on different tracks. After putting all of your instruments in the right tracks tuned correctly and with a good envelope, it's time to think about panning of each instrument. When playing back all the instruments without panning each one, it almost sounds like some of the instruments are getting in the way of each other. Both Koji Kondo and Hajime Wakai seem to have spent a good amount of time thinking about where they want their instruments panned, so you want those to be as accurate as possible. I used other OSTs I found to figure out how certain instruments were panned, and I also used the game to see how some things sounded in order to get panning just right. After all of that, the track is almost completely done. Sometimes I would need to change some volumes for certain instruments, I might need to automate some things, and I need to loop the track and make sure it sounded right for the soundtrack. But otherwise, the track was pretty much done. That is, if you're doing a Wakai track. Koji Kondo's tracks are a completely different beast. Wakai's tracks looked all like organized, everything looked so good. This is what Koji Kondo's tracks look like. What is this? Koji Kondo's MIDI sequences were all on one track, without being separated at all by different MIDI tracks. Now how this was possible on the N64 is beyond me, but somehow the N64 was able to read each instrument differently without getting confused by other instruments on the same track. After doing this entire project, there are some explanations as to why he did this. I guess, for starters, Koji Kondo changes between samples constantly, especially with strings. He had a sample for low, mid, and high strings, and switched between them depending on where the notes were in the strings. It's like he knew where each sample sounded the best and accounted for that by changing which one played which notes all the time. It's just unfortunate that he had to put everything on one track to account for this, since this was definitely the reason why this took as long as it did. With every single Kondo track, you'd have to pick apart individual notes and put them to the correct instrument, and sometimes just hope that you're right. Sometimes instruments would share the same MIDI notes, sometimes MIDI notes would overlap each other, and you'd have to account for all of it while also doing all the other things I've talked about previously. It's insane how the N64 actually made this work. There were some constants with these MIDI tracks though, like the snare samples being played on the same two notes most of the time, or the timpani parts being 2 octaves above what it normally plays at, so you already know what part that is. Otherwise, you'd have to figure out every other part. It was interesting, to say the least. And that was pretty much the general idea of what I did for each track. I didn't expect there to be too much interest in how this was made, so I tried to make a quick explanation video as best as I could. I hope this explains some things a bit better for people who had questions about it. And if you have any more questions, please let me know on Twitter or in the comments. I'd love to answer some as best as I can. Thank you guys for watching.